African summits, you've seen them in Paris, Brussels, Beijing, Ankara, for only the second time ever, Washington. After 2014, the Biden administration hosting an Africa Leaders Summit with superpower rivalries heating up. There'll be no long lectures forecast on human rights and corruption. Instead, Washington bowing to the African Union's own blueprint on sustainable growth. Talking up pledges of aid. Is it the same script as former colonial powers, France and Britain? We'll be asking about trade, security, and also about soft power. In a globalized world, the West wants to rally support and counter disinformation. On that score, what's the responsibility of a U.S. tech sector whose outsized power can sometimes unwittingly fuel that disinformation? And if U.S. politicians can now find Africa on a map, it's also because of a spectacular surge in immigrants coming from the continent. How much clout do the dual citizens from countries like Nigeria and Ethiopia carry inside of the Beltway? How do they impact politics in their country of origin? Today in the France 24 debate, we're looking at Joe Biden's African charm offensive. We'll be joined from Washington by Niger's ambassador to the United States, Mamadou Kyari Liman Tingiri. With us, Nyagale Bakayokos, chair of the Africa Security Sector Network. Good to see you.
Good evening.
Political consultant Emmanuel Iga is with us as well. How are things?
Very fine. Thank you.
Thank you. And from London, he's the former UK ambassador to Ghana, Nicholas Westwood, director of the Royal African Society. Thanks for joining us.
Good evening.
The France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook and Twitter, hashtag F24debate. 45 leaders out of 55 present in Washington. Quite a turnout for a U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, where there's plenty at stake, as Liza Kamenoff explains.
$55 billion, a US pledge of commitment to Africa over the next 3 years that promises to tackle food security and climate change. 49 countries gathered in Washington for the US-Africa Leaders Summit, the first of its kind since 2014. First on the US agenda, economic aid in the form of student exchange programs and investment to African businesses.
Good morning, everyone. We will be announcing additional investments to make it easier for students to participate in exchange programs between our countries, to increase trade opportunities for members of the African diaspora, and to support African entrepreneurs and small businesses.
But it's not all about lifting the economy. China's driven investment in Africa, coupled with Russia's arms sales and increased mercenary deployment, means the two nations are expanding their footprint on the continent. This poses a threat to US interests, who is trying to assert its influence there.
Regarding Russia and China, the PRC, we're witnessing the PRC expand its footprint on the continent on a daily basis. And as they do that, they're also expanding their economic influence. In turning to Russia, we see Russia continuing to peddle cheap weapons. Some of that was mentioned before by one of our senior leaders here. And also, we see Russia employing mercenaries across the continent, and that is destabilizing as well.
Following requests from Senegal and South Africa, Biden is expected to push for the African Union joining the G20 group as a permanent member. The group, comprised of the world's largest economies, could provide some economic protection for the African Union from China and Russia's so-called debt traps.
Nicholas Westcott, what's changed when you look at the optics of this summit since 2014, when it was Barack Obama hosting African leaders?
Yeah, there's quite a lot of continuity in that U.S. policy towards Africa has always been driven partly by the Black Caucus in the U.S. Congress, which has powerfully argued for strong links and has pushed through some legislative actions like AGOA on trade and supported PEPFAR. Then there's the counterterrorism, which came after 9/11, and still the US put a high priority on chasing jihadis across Africa. But then there's the geostrategic competition you were just talking about there, as well as the business interests that the US has. And definitely the geostrategic competition has risen up the agenda. Because whereas China previously was very engaged, particularly on the economic side in Africa, it's now felt that they are more concerned to turn that economic influence into political influence and are looking for allies. And Russia, too, is actually increasing its effort on the information wars and on security side, even though it gives hardly a penny in development aid and very little in terms of buying African produce. So the US, this has risen up the agenda, and it is one reason why the Biden administration has been keen to attract African leaders to Washington.
We're pleased to be joined by Ambassador Liman Tingari of Niger, who's with us attending that summit. Is this, thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Is this the amount of attention that Africa is due? Has Washington got it right?
I'm sorry, I didn't get you well. Can you repeat the question, please?
I said, has Washington got it right in the way they've organized this summit?
I think this summit is really timely for us, at least from the perspective of Niger, and I guess that's the case from all Africa perspective, as Mr. Faki said it very well. As Niger, our president, Mr. Mohamed Bazoum, came here with a strong message to convey to the American authority. As you may know, we have strong cooperation with the United States. We have military cooperation. We have civilian and development cooperation. And we're working together also to mitigate the impact of climate change on our population. So as a Sahelian country, we're heavily impacted by climate change. Basically, President Bazoum's message is threefold. We are a democratic country. We are upholding the rule of the law. So we are an island of stability in a very destabilized region. Number two, we have strong cooperation with all our allies, including the United States. And thirdly, we are working hard to fight poverty by trying to contain our demographic growth. That was the message of President Bazoum to the summit. He has got engagement with Secretary Blinken. He has got engagement with Secretary Houston. He has got engagement with Samantha Power, the USAID administrator. So we're very happy. So far, it's going very well. President Bazoum has also engaged senators and congressmen. So far, really, it's going very well for us.
Nyagere Bakayoko, you heard there Liman Tingari talk about Niger being an island of stability. The U.S., it's one of the few countries in Africa where it has a military presence, with a drone base there. And we saw already with the recent visit by the French president to Washington that these security concerns were at the heart of the West's preoccupations. What does Washington bring that France doesn't when it comes to fighting jihadists, when it comes to stability in that region?
First, it's very important to remember that the US began to fight terrorism in the region long before French with the so-called Pan-Sahel initiative, which was a training effort dedicated to prevent terrorism to spread over West Africa. It is also important to remember the role of the African, which is the African Command, which was set up under the Bush administration and which headquarters is located in Germany, but whose presence is also materialized by a rather important number of military bases. It's not well known, but there are between 6,000 and 7,000 US military presently present on the African continent. The most important of them being based in Djibouti at Camp Lemonnier. And then you have the presence in the Horn of Africa, in Kenya, Somalia, Uganda as well. And also in Western Africa, you have camps in Dakar or in Ghana. So the strategy of the US is much more lower profile than the French one, and it is more based on intelligence and logistics, and not on a presence on the ground, at the difference of France itself.
And we're seeing that the French are on the back foot. They've been kindly asked to leave Mali recently. The same could happen in Burkina Faso, where you've recently had a coup. How does the United States react to all of this? It's not their issue, or it is?
It is their issue, but it's important to remember that Africa has always been seen as treated with benign neglect by all the different US administrations, including the democratic ones. Of course, there has been a kind of new approach with the Trump administration, who simply was saying that there were absolutely no strategic interest of the United States on the African soil. But we have also to remember that the traditional approach has been to base the US policy on the views of former colonial powers. And this is one of the reasons why the US have also been closely working with French Barkhane operations, in particular by bringing intelligence and also airport transport facilities. So I think we can see a kind of competition, of course, between France and the UN on the US on the economic field, but not really on the strategic and military one.
Of course, when it comes to economics, it's not so much France that the US is looking at, but China as a trade rival. Washington insists, and you heard it in that report at the outset, that it's not all about China. Beijing says it better not be.
The US should respect the will of African people and take concrete actions to help Africa's development rather than smearing and attacking other countries.
Emmanuel Iga, your reaction to that, and how much of the interest, you heard there Niagale talk about how the US traditionally has had benign neglect when it comes to Africa. Are they paying attention because of China?
Yes. One of the reasons is that I think it's beginning to dawn on the USA that Africa is the basket of the resources that will be needed for what we are beginning to call the fourth industrial revolution. We're looking at the technology of the future and all the resources, the minerals that you will need for that. It's Africa that has them in commercial quantities, particularly the Democratic Republic of Congo. And this seems to have been understood by the Chinese much earlier than the Americans. I think I looked at the map of Africa recently, and I saw that the Chinese are very well established in about 35 countries of the 54 or 55 countries of the African continent. They are very well established. And the USA is seeing this now. Our brother in London, Ambassador Westcott, yes, Nicholas Westcott, did mention how China is trying now to transit from just simple presence on the ground to try to garner political influence, which China needs geopolitically, global influence. And they are trying to use their African economic connections to build that political influence. So this is something that really doesn't please the Americans because, well, the Americans understand that where Africans are beginning to turn very, very, in a very focused way towards China and like telling us that it's not where we do business that matters. It's who is able to kind of bring Africa out of its very dire straits of at the moment. If you're like drowning, you really don't care who throws the rope to you to pull you ashore. And Africa is in a very terrible state now. And they don't have any problem dealing with China and even with Russia for that reason. So the USA sees the geopolitical risks involved for America's interests and the Western interests in this kind of attitude of the African countries, and I think they're trying to react to that.
The U.S. making the argument that they have ties that bind, like you were saying, the Chinese, who have more than 1 million citizens on the continent. The number of African immigrants to the U.S. has tripled since the year 2000 from countries like Ethiopia, Nigeria, Ghana. Their children often pursue higher education and act each one as ambassadors both for their homelands and for the United States. The U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Linda Thomas Greenfield, spoke to our own Ketevan Gorgistani.
The diaspora community here in the United States is a huge, huge asset for us that provides opportunities to engage with African countries through people-to-people relationships that China doesn't have. So there's no competition there.
And final question, will we get a presidential trip to Africa in the coming year?
I've heard a rumor. It was reported. I think it would be absolutely fantastic.
All right, so maybe a trip there, Nicholas Westcott, by Joe Biden to Africa, says his UN ambassador. Do you take her point that because of you have so many dual nationals now, that that gives the U.S. a kind of an advantage over China?
Yes, very much so, and it's the same here in the UK. The person-to-person links between the diaspora community and those back home are very strong and are becoming a growing political influence. The US is quite complicated because both the Black Caucus and the whole political dialogue has been based very much on the African-American experience coming out of slavery, the Black Lives Matter movement, and it has been overwhelmingly sort of supportive of the Democratic Party. And the diaspora are in a slightly different place because they come seeking economic opportunity in the same way that other immigrant communities have done to the US. They are looking to achieve in the US what they could not back home because of the lack of economic opportunities. So they're very entrepreneurial. They're very active in the creative industries, in the tech industries. And that's where they have a real advantage over much of the rest of the world, this link into the cutting edge of fintech in Africa as well as in the US. So it's quite a different dynamic. And as it grows in influence, it'll be interesting to see whether black politics in the US diversifies.
Chiari Limantingiri, have you seen an evolution when it comes to, again, that relationship between Africans who live in the United States and the way they're perceived by Washington?
Again, it's very noisy. I don't hear you well. The question is, what do we see as a benefit for U.S. and Africa relations?
No, the question is, how much has the clout of those Africans who live in the U.S. grown? Have you felt it?
Oh, you're talking about the diaspora?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Again, we have the big African diaspora here in the United States that they all use. Those countries that are traditionally most represented are really not West African French-speaking countries. The most represented country is Nigeria. We have a diaspora from Niger. It's growing fast, and we do believe that diaspora is a way to build a bridge between Africa and the United States. That, for me, something that is obvious, and that's also something on which we can build economic relationship. It's not just about remittances, but it goes beyond. It's also about more foreign direct investment. It's about more trade. For instance, the AGOA, African Growth Opportunity Act, will be really enacted, will be really operated by those who are from Africa and who are here and have established their own business for the very reason that they know both sides of the game, so they can take most benefit of it. We have no hesitation about promoting involvement of the diaspora into our country.
Is it different? Is it different than when you deal with France or deal with the UK?
I'm not really an expert on diaspora, and I don't know how it goes with UK. I'm speaking from the position where I am, which is in United States. So I wouldn't go into comparing it with what is going on in the state, but in the UK. But from the state, it's very clear that diaspora is for us an asset. It's an asset for trade. It's an asset for foreign direct investment. We already have African and even people from Niger who are well placed in big companies that are exploring to do business in our country. Last month I was in Houston, and we have Nigerian working in American companies who wanted to go and to explore more opportunities in mining and oil producing in our country. So I see it clearly as a very positive trend, as a bridge that will help not only trade but also investment. So it clearly goes beyond remittances.
Traditional, well beyond remittances. I know Houston, where there's a big Nigerian community as well. Perhaps the best illustration of that diaspora, if you look at the current news cycle, is a gentleman by the name of Timothy Weah, scored the opening goal for the United States against Wales at the World Cup. He's a U.S. citizen. His father, a football legend, happens to be the current president of Liberia, George Weah. Nicholas Westcott, when you look at those images of George Weah, putting aside, there's a little bit of controversy, I know, back home where he is because of the fact that he's been abroad now for so many days in a row, something since way before the start of the tournament. But it's a reminder that, the U.S. doesn't have former colonies in Africa, but Liberia is the closest thing that comes to that. And when you look at the picture today, how the U.S. interacts with the continent, how far removed is it from the days when it had a very cozy relationship with Liberia?
Things have evolved quite a lot, and the US, to some extent, has suffered by implication with France and UK as being collectively the Western imperialists, as they are termed by some. And this has been reputationally quite tricky because it's been quite easy, and the Russians and Chinese have been active in stoking up hostility towards Western influence, pushing it back to the colonial days. And so African governments have been very sensitive of being seen as too close. Governments tend to be quite close to both France, UK, and the US, but the people are rather more skeptical, and the leaders have to take care of that. And therefore, there has been some distancing of African governments from the former colonial powers and the US. So the relationships are a lot less cozy than they were, but they still know there's tremendous advantage for them in staying close to these big Western economies. It's where the economic growth is going to come from, where the trade is, and where their people are migrating to. So it's a mixed picture. The links remain very close, but they are also politically sensitive.
The United States, which it has played an active role recently in several points across the continent, mediating in Sudan, in Ethiopia, where a recent ceasefire has now enabled the International Red Cross to send much-needed relief to the rebel region of Tigray. Speaking of Ethiopia, the consequences can be grave when that benign neglect, it goes too far. In Nairobi, a lawsuit filed on Tuesday against Facebook's parent company, this on behalf of two Ethiopians, one whose father, an academic, was murdered after repeated lynching calls on the social media site, and the other, a Tigrayan researcher for Amnesty International, who's been the target of a torrent of online abuse.
In January 6th, when there was the Capitol riot, the break the glass measures were undertaken to protect an American population. We're talking about conflict in Ethiopia. My client was a victim of that. Why haven't the break the glass measures been employed in similar environments, or even tougher measures for people who are going through more dire situations?
There's light touch regulation in the U.S. when it comes to social media. It could even get lighter the way things are going right now at Twitter. Nyagale Bakayoko, that's got consequences for Africa.
Yes, and this is a question which is closely related to all these informational warfare, in fact, which is also at the heart of strategic competitions between foreign powers on the African continent. And we can see that today support to bloggers, to some personalities with lots of influence is also a matter of competition. We can see that Western support to those free speeches is very often targeted both by African governments, some African civil society organizations, which are also supported by other foreign powers, such as Russia, for instance.
Yeah, because Europeans are currently working on regulation, Emmanuel Liga. They say that, these very libertarian views on what free speech is that are employed by these giant U.S. tech companies, which essentially own most of the social media giants, that's not going to fly in the future. When you look, for instance, you have an election coming up in Nigeria in just a couple of months' time. Has Africa gotten any better when it comes to fighting disinformation?
Well, that's a very tough issue. It's kind of a double-edged sword, just like Nyagale said. Africa is basically taking the best advantage possible of the capacity of freedom of speech on the social media that we now have. And a lot of Africans have mastered the use of all the social medias, Facebook and all those things, Twitter. Yes, you're right. A good part of election campaign, particularly in the Nigerian election campaign, is going on in the social media. It's just as important as what happens on the ground, in the rallies and all that. It helps to bring the campaign on the international scene and to connect supporters, connect candidates with people who are inside the countries, with the people who are in the diaspora. Unfortunately, well, in the case of Nigeria that you just mentioned, the diaspora still doesn't have the right to vote. They've been clamoring for that, and probably they will get it soon. But many African countries have their diasporas now voting in elections. So the social media has been very instrumental to making this a success.
What's your reaction to this lawsuit that's been filed in Nairobi against Facebook's parent company?
I think it will get a wide support from the African public. Of course, because this is something that has cost the life of somebody. and a lot of people are put in danger. We shouldn't have situations whereby Facebook or Twitter owners, react when they are forced to do so by the government, when the governments feel they've been attacked unduly by bloggers and all that. That has happened in Nigeria. Nigeria tried to put pressure on Twitter. Twitter really didn't like shifts, and there was a period that Twitter was completely shut down in Nigeria. So I think it's back again. So we're going to have this situation whereby there will be a lot of controversy, and I think a lot of the public that uses the social media will be looking for a better control of hate speech, of narratives that fuel crisis, eventually can lead to assassinations and all that in Africa. But they will be very careful to ensure that they still keep that freedom of talking on the social media, which is very, very important.
Nicholas Westcott, again, there's the saying that America owns the internet. It's a bit of an exaggeration, but do you get a sense, at a summit like this one, that perhaps that's overlooked just how much power Silicon Valley has to shaping events on the African continent?
I think we're all becoming increasingly aware of the power of the Silicon Valley social media companies to shape many things. And it is true in Africa as well. I think it's particularly sensitive in some of the local language versions of Facebook, which are not monitored as well. And that's where a great deal of the hate speech has been used. And somewhere like Ethiopia, that can be very incendiary. And I think that underpins this court case and why there is quite a lot of substance to it. There will need to be a lot more close monitoring and policing of what goes on, because we saw back in the genocide in Rwanda, that these things can very swiftly get out of control if they're allowed to. So we're all becoming conscious of it. In places like the European Union, there's quite a sophisticated system for putting these controls on. In Africa, it's a lot less. But always, it's only exacerbating something that is already there. There are underlying causes of conflict. They're not caused by the social media, but they can be exacerbated by it.
Chiari Limantingari, you agree?
Say again?
Do you agree, Chiari?
I didn't get the question.
It was, is the problem that social media is the way the social media companies are set up with not enough monitoring, or is the problem simply that there are underlying factors that are particular to each country?
I think they are both. It's very clear that should it be in Africa, in Europe, or in America, politics under the era of social media is not the same as before. It's I think, something we need to recognize, and that the social media have changed the way political communication can be done. And I think they have taken part of the power of normal traditional mass media. That said, what goes into social media is rarely properly moderated, which means that sometimes it can be only symptoms of problems that are largely diffused over social media. But sometimes, yes, they can reveal serious underlying causes. I personally tend to believe that social media do more harm than good to public debate.
Ambassador Limantigiri, I'm gonna interrupt you because we're gonna go over to Washington and listen in to the U.S. President Joe Biden, who is addressing a business forum as part of that summit.
Yourselves, make it short, Biden. There's a semifinal game coming up. I get it. I see Secretary Kerry over there nodding. Hey, John, how are you, pal? Well, I want to thank Secretary Mundo. She is one of the brightest and best folks I have working with me, and for all of you in this room for making this forum a success, particularly in Prosper Africa Deal Room. That sounds like something that we shouldn't be saying. Prosper Africa Deal Room. I kept asking, where's the deal room? I think I'm looking at it. Folks, I want to thank you all for being here, particularly since I said Morocco is about to play as the first African nation in the semifinals of the World Cup. Distinguished heads of state, leaders of regional and global institutions, and of course, representatives of more than 300 companies, African and American. Welcome to Washington. And I want to recognize our co-hosts, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and the Corporate Council of Africa, two great champions for building and growing ties of business and trade and investment between Africa and the United States, as well as the members of my administration and the members of Congress who are here today. All the members of Congress, please stand up if you're here so I can identify who you are. There's the man. All right, I'm sure you're out there somewhere. Look, this forum is about building connections. It's about closing deals, and above all, it's about the future, our shared future. We've known for a long time that Africa's success and prosperity is essential to assuring a better future for all of us, not just for Africa. I've been engaged in these issues going back to my days as a young man in the United States Senate. When I was on the Foreign Relations Committee, I was chairman of the African Affairs Subcommittee and got to spend a lot of time in Africa. I visited almost all of your countries. When I was vice president serving with President Obama, we hosted the first U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, including U.S.-Africa Business Forum. We saw so clearly the enormous potential that we could harness if we did it together. And holding the first of its kind summit in 2014 was a watershed moment to cement new kinds of partnerships between our nations. Partnerships not to create political obligation, or foster dependence, but to spur shared success. I emphasize shared success and opportunity. Because when Africa succeeds, the United States succeeds. Quite frankly, the whole world succeeds as well. Now, 8 years later, the world has undergone a great many changes. We're still grappling with the deadly pandemic, facing down war and instability, addressing economic challenges with global impact, fighting rising food prices, tackling the impacts of climate change. And each of these crises has only heightened the vital role African nations and peoples play to address the global challenges that drive our global progress. We can't solve any of these challenges without African leadership at the table. And I'm not trying to be nice, that's a fact. African ideas and innovation helping to shape the solutions, and African population contributing to every step. So the only question when I took office was not if we'd host another U.S.-African Leadership Summit, but when. My administration's engagement with Africa and the priority we place on these relationships began on day one. We've been working steadily with regional diplomacy and investments to demonstrate our commitment. We harnessed decades of cooperation through PEPFAR and President's Malaria Initiative and other partnerships in global health security to help save lives and combat COVID-19. The United States delivered 231 million doses of vaccines to 49 countries across Africa, and work together with you to get the vaccines into the arms in hard-to-reach communities. Critically, we invested in Africa's capacity to manufacture its own vaccines, diagnostics, and therapeutics so Africa can meet its own needs and contribute to the global supply chain. And even as we work to end COVID-19, we continue building stronger health systems and institutions and accelerating efforts to achieve universal health coverage, to make sure we're better prepared to tackle the health challenges, including the next pandemic, and there surely will be one. We also advanced our commitment to strengthen food security, including expanding the Feed the Future program to partner with 8 additional African countries. And I'll be speaking more tomorrow about this effort to both address the immediate food crisis and strengthen the food system in Africa for the long term. We're taking on climate crisis, prioritizing not just energy transition in America, but in nations of all of Africa, and meeting the urgent needs to countries to adapt to the climate impacts that are already here. Just last month, I traveled to COP27 in Egypt, where I announced $150 million in an effort to support adaptation efforts in Africa, a down payment of my commitment to provide $3 billion annually to global adaptation efforts for 2024. And in a year that has seen elections across Africa, we've worked together with the African Union to strengthen democracy and the core values that unite our people, all our people, especially young people: freedom, opportunity, transparency, good governance. Now, you might be thinking, this is a forum dedicated to deepening business ties and advancing two-way trade investments between Africa and the United States. Why is Biden talking so much about all these other areas? Well, it's because Africa's economic transition depends on good government, healthy populations, and reliable and affordable energy. These things business seeks out when they're looking to invest. They attract new opportunities, and they launch new partnerships. And the United States is committed to supporting every aspect of Africa's inclusive growth and creating the best possible environment for sustained commercial engagement between Africa companies and American companies. The United States is all in on Africa's future. And the work we've done over the past 2 years, building on decades of vital investments made under previous American
live remarks
presidents.
by the U.S. President Joe Biden there, addressing those African leaders. Just very briefly, Nyegede Bakayoko, the U.S. President, we said at the outset, there's not going to be a lecture on democracy during this summit, but still, he says, if you want to have robust trade, you do need good governance, you do need democracy. Your reaction to those words?
But in fact, that's exactly what is put forward in the new U.S.-American strategy toward Africa, which has been adopted in last August 2022, and in fact, which is continuing to try shaping the world, and in particular Africa, according to the values and interests of the United States. And that's where we can see how important is the normative aspect, not only the economic one, not only the hard power one, but the normative aspects of the U.S. approach, which is putting the stretch of free speech, etc., but for instance, on LGBTQ, etc. And that is where it can become very difficult for the U.S. to impose themselves in front of some other powers which are saying, no, we need conservatism, we don't need democracy, and development will not come from those Western view and approach to Africa.
All right, so the battle far from won. We'll have to leave it there for now. I want to thank you, Nyegede Bakayoko. I want to thank as well Emmanuel Iga, Ambassador Liman Tingiri in Washington, Nicholas Westcott in London. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate. Ouais, c'est pas gagné.